the key point is that the moisture is a trigger for germination. The good seed soil contact helps the seed to take up the moisture. But having moisture soon after cultivation is really, really important to stimulate germination. If dry condition persists after cultivation, many grass weeds simply won't germinate or remain dormant until the rain arrives.
Harvest marks the end of the season and prompts farmers to think about next year's crops and what improvements can be made for the season ahead. Cultural control of weeds is one of the first jobs every farmer should be thinking about, and this can begin as soon after harvest as possible, although this year the dry, hard ground may delay it somewhat until we get some rain. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. If you're enjoying the series, we really appreciate it if you could follow the podcast and leave a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Reducing the number of grass and broadleaf weed seeds that have fallen to the ground over the past few weeks is a critical step in lowering the overall weed burden over time. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Vijaya Bhaskar, a weed researcher at Teagasc Oak Park, to talk about the best ways to achieve maximum control of these weeds in stubbles. Vijay, first of all, just in terms of grass weeds, you might briefly outline which of these species are currently of greatest concern to Irish tillage farmers.
Michael, I suppose sterile brome and wild oats are still the most widespread and competitive grass weeds in our tillage crops. We are also seeing the expansion of other problem grass weeds, the likes of blackgrass, Italian ryegrass, and dry bromes. If I had to single out one, I fear Italian ryegrass the most. It can be a problem in both winter and spring crop. It is less responsive to pre-emergence residual herbicides and cultural controls. It can also develop resistance to the likes of selective spring herbicides, Axial and Pacifica relatively quickly. And there is also a much higher risk of these weeds developing, these population developing glyphosate resistance. So Italian ryegrass would be the number one that I'm more concerned about.
Okay, and obviously the other ones are not to be trifled with either if they kind of go out of control as well. But just thinking about the various different weeds, and as I say, I think at the end of harvest is the starting point to controlling the weeds kind of going forward in for next year. But you know, in terms of the dormancy of the various different weeds, so in other words, the period of time between when the seed is ripe and when that seed will actually germinate and produce a plant. So that can vary between species. Is there much of a variation between species, or are they relatively similar and we can just get on with it?
Michael, I suppose the weather we get around flowering and seed set, usually from the end of May through to July, each year can have a big influence on how dormant weed seeds are. Okay, so if you take the likes of blackgrass, the UK research has shown that cool and wet condition during seed development can lead to higher dormancy. But warmer and drier condition produce less dormant seeds. But if you take the likes of Italian ryegrass and most of brome species, generally have low dormancy and are less affected by weather conditions. And also there is a different requirement, light versus dark. This is something we look at particularly with brome species. As you know, sterile brome and great brome, they require darkness for germination. Our previous assumption based on UK recommendation was that the likes of rye brome or other brome species require light to germinate. But in our recent experiment conducted in Oak Park, that was not the case. These brome showed over 90% germination in both light and dark condition across different temperatures we tested. So to keep it simple, in fields with the mixed brome population, shallow cultivation soon after harvest can help encourage germination if there is enough moisture available. Okay,
so this is a bit of a departure, Vijay, in terms of the previous advice. Before, as you mentioned, we had sterile brome and great brome needing to be cultivated to bury them underneath the ground a little bit, so you get that dark scenario and they'll germinate a bit better. Whereas the soft bromes and rye bromes and those ones, we were saying no, leave them on the top, leave them there for 3 or 4 weeks, and they will do better in terms of germination and that end of it. Explain to me how you figured that out in terms of that there's really no great difference between any of the brome species there. How did you do that?
So we grew them in a controlled condition and we exposed them in a different temperatures. So right from 5 degrees Celsius up to 25 degrees Celsius, and we also provided the dark and the light condition for the seeds to germinate. What we found, the likes of sterile and great brome, the germination was much higher. In darkness compared to light, but when it comes to the likes of other broma species, especially the rye bromes, which we often misidentify as soft brome, showed more than 90% germination, both in light and dark condition across temperatures. So that's why, based on that evidence, I suppose the previous message of leaving them on the soil isn't wrong, because if you have rye brome alone, whether you leave them or shallow cultivate them, that doesn't make a big difference. But if you have a mixed brome species like a sterile brome and rye brome, the advice would be to shallow cultivate so that you can trigger both the species, trigger germination of both the species.
And in that experiment that you carried out, which I think was in growth chambers, which were kind of little tiny cupboards, if you like, that were able to, you're able to stimulate different temperatures, as you said yourself, but also duration of light through the time. Within that experiment, VJ, did you test out the depth of the burial of seed? Probably not this year in terms of how hard the ground is, but other years, is there a fear that excessive cultivation that you end up burying the seed down to 3 or 4 inches that you're not going to get much of a germination, or what's the ideal in your opinion?
Look, we haven't tested, Michael. That's a part of a PhD, and we will be soon testing the impact, the effect of different soil depth. But I suppose for all the early germinating grass seeds, the likes of most brome species or a black grass or an Italian ryegrass, to trigger germination, you have to keep stale seedbed cultivation shallow, which is
Shallow.
less than 5 centimeter. Okay, if you want to suppress weed emergence, you do a deeper cultivation. So about 10 or 15 centimeter often be effective.
I suppose that's music to people's ears because the fact that soils are very dry across the majority of the country, and people will kind of call it, it's like kind of like Bel Air, and it'd be very hard to get some cultivation equipment down deep into it anyways. But just with that, within the UK advice, I suppose there was a bit of I suppose information, especially around blackgrass, where they talked about predation of the various different seeds, either through beetles or worms or other things that actually can degrade the seed, so it actually is as good as germination, I suppose. What is the thinking around that now? Is it, will you get that anyways? What are you cultivate or not?
Michael, I suppose it depends on the soil moisture. In a very dry fields, stubble cultivation may not be worthwhile because wheat seed need moisture to germination. So in these conditions, it is actually be better to leave the seed on the soil surface, allowing natural predation that you mentioned to reduce the seed bank. So the key message is not to cultivate dry soil just for the sake of it. Wait for moisture if conditions are unlikely to trigger germination. So I keep saying that the key point is that the moisture is a trigger for germination. The good seed soil contact helps the seed to take up the moisture. But having moisture soon after cultivation is really, really important to stimulate germination. If dry condition persist after cultivation, many grass seeds simply won't germinate or remain dormant until the rain arrives.
Okay, again, probably music to people's ears in the sense of they don't particularly want to cultivate in some of that really hard soil. But on the other hand, if they're under pressure and a bit of cultivation was done, when the rain arrives, it's going to germinate away. And if you do get a germination, initially after the first cultivation, because I think we are due a little bit of rain over the next few days, VJ. When is there, because I suppose we have a relatively early harvest this year, is there time for a second or even a third stale seedbed where farmers are worried that there was possibly a relatively big population of that weed in the field?
Michael, I suppose, like you mentioned, with harvest running earlier this year, there is a real opportunity on many farms to fit in two or multiple stale seed beds before the plant drilling dates. Particularly where early germinating grass weeds, the likes of black grass or Italian ryegrass or brome weed pressure is high. I recommend a shallow cultivation soon after harvest, then leave around 2 to 3 weeks for a good flush of weeds to emerge. And if conditions are favorable and time allows, a second shallow cultivation can help catch another flush before drying. course, it depends on moisture. In dry condition, you may not get enough weed emergence to justify multiple passes, while in a wet autumn, the benefit of extra stale seedbed has to be balanced against the risk of losing good drilling condition.
Sure, sure. Well, hopefully we won't end up in that. But where you have a your first cultivation, you see after maybe 3 weeks or thereabouts, you're going to see a bit of a green mist on the field. Is that around the time you kind of go back? And with that, would a farmer consider going back with glyphosate before to cultivate again, or will a cultivation around that stage be sufficient to stimulate more weeds coming through and maybe kill off some of the ones that are trying to that have already germinated and there's a bit of a green shoot on them?
I suppose, Michael, cultivation alone can often be sufficient to remove the first flush of weeds in a stale seedbed. So there is no need for glyphosate after every flush, if you see what I mean. This helps reduce selection pressure and the risk of resistance. Even where multiple stale seedbeds are warranted, glyphosate may only be needed once for the final flush, with cultivation being adequate for the earlier flushes.
Okay, so this the final application of glyphosate is probably the most important one before you plant the main crop. Would that be correct?
That's correct. And I also want to highlight in terms of the use of glyphosate, which is something that we have done some work in Oak Park. So especially when using glyphosate in a stubble or a pre-sowing pre-sowing application, it is important to use at least 720 to 1080 grams per hectare, which is 2 or 3 liters of 360 glyphosate to control most annual grass weeds. They should be around 5 to 10 centimeter green leaf area when spraying, or at least 2 to 3 leaf stage. And one exception, I suppose, is a rat tail fescue, which is becoming quite a concern especially in a non-plow system, and it needs a maximum of 4 liters, which is 4 liters of 360 glyphosate or 1440, and the application has to be targeted at tillering phase for maximum efficacy.
Okay, so there's two different rates there. There's 2 liters or 3 liters of 360 grams per liter of glyphosate. There's quite a big difference there. Is that dependent on the type of product that you have, or is that dependent on the size of weed that you're trying to control, the general weeds in the stubble?
I suppose, Michael, when you go for such a high rate like a 1080 or 1440, what we found is that there is not much difference between the products. So I suppose the most important thing is not to cut the rates.
So if you're in a non, is it a generic based brand, you should really be at the 3 liters per hectare, and if you're at the more established brand, I suppose the Monsanto Roundup kind of brands, you can go for that lower rate. Would that be right?
That's not correct. Regardless of the product, you have to keep up the rates. We see those differences when we are spraying at a lower rate, but when we are spraying at 1080 or a 1440, the differences between the generic and the Roundup brands start to diminish. But I suppose if you have a blackgrass or Italian ryegrass, you don't want to mess with them, and you have to really use your best tools, and that's where your Roundups and the robust rate becomes essential.
Okay, so the 3 liters is really what people should be targeting, one with the other.
100%. About
Okay.
3 liters at least, or 4 liters,
Or 4 liters.
depending upon if you have a rat tail fescue or if the fields has a perennial scutch, you go with the depending upon the density, you go with the 4 liter.
Look, I suppose, and I was in a field only just the other day where the spring barley was yet to be cut, but I came across a number of single plants of wild oats here and there around the field that obviously weren't controlled, and the other side of it, they weren't rogued either. You're in the final year of a very big project where you are still in a position to test some of these weeds seeds to see whether they're resistant for glyphosate. Are you still open for business for that, or is that ship sailed?
Like you pointed out, this is the final year for widespread resistance testing being carried out as a part of the Evolve Grass Weed project. So this is probably the last opportunity to submit samples of any grass and broadleaf weeds. Where resistance is suspected, I suppose growers or the advisors collect at least 250 ml mug of seed for the likes of blackgrass or Italian ryegrass, or a pint of seed for wild oat or sterile brome. All they have to do is that put the dry seed into a paper envelope and complete the testing form available online or through their advisor, and post it to Oak Park. In case if farmers would like us to collect their sample, they should get in touch.
Okay. Touch to you here in Oak Park. Um,
100%.
yeah. So for a farmer who takes a sample, VJ, you might just walk us through the process of that you employ to actually, come back with a result. What's the process and how long does that normally take?
As I mentioned, Michael, the likes of Italian ryegrass and bromes, there is there is not much issue with dormancy, and those population can be readily germinated. So testing takes. So the process is we get the seeds, we sow them and allow them to grow, allow them to reach 2 to 4 leaf stage, and we test across all the all the products that are active for that particular species. So it could be axial, pacifica, the graminicides, the cycloxidum, the clethodim, and the Broadway stars and glyphosate. As an example for Italian ryegrass, so we are testing across all the products out there, and it takes about 30 days from spraying to visualize the symptoms. So so the entire process takes about at least 60 days. And once we complete the trial, we let the farmer know the status of whether their population is resistant or not. And also we also tell them what product may be effective on their population. And this is mostly the phenotypic process in the glasshouse. We also go a step further and collect the leaf sample for a DNA testing. It's a and we it's like we do a simple PCR like a COVID test to know what type of mutation is present, which reconfirms what we found in the glasshouse.
Gives a more accurate kind of detail exactly what's the genetics in behind it.
100%, yes.
So that information then that a farmer is going to get back around those grass weeds will either confirm that the particular weed is resistant to either an entire group of herbicides or maybe partially within that group of herbicides, which to a degree might be able to in some cases, and I think there's a good few cases there, Vijay, if I'm right in saying it, that a number of options became available to farmers. Mightn't mean for too long, but where a farmer could still control those, whether it's wild oats or blackgrass or whatever, for a little bit longer on their farm, and be able then to put a better overall strategy in place to try and control that. So that information coming from you was crucially important for the operation of that farm for the next number of years around that weed.
That helps, Michael. But the problem is that often we get the samples that are developed resistance. So when we go back with the over the last couple of years, I don't see how the information is helpful, especially with the likes of Italian ryegrass, because most often the population are resistant to multiple modes of action. Yeah, when I say multiple modes of action, it is resistant. Some of the population most of the population that we tested last year, it was resistant across all the products that are available, be it axial, the Falcon or the Stratus Ultra or Clethodim and Pacifica and Broadway Star. So as I said the start of the podcast, that I fear the Italian ryegrass most because of
Okay.
the resistance that it is developing. In those cases, the options are very little, but when it comes to the likes of brome or wild oats, the information is very helpful for them to contain the problem.
We started talking about stubble cultivation, which is one of the main cultural control methods. Just for you, Vijay, just to finish up on this, are there any other major cultural control methods that you would advise farmers can do over the next number of months to try and reduce populations of grass weeds on their farm?
If I had to leave growers with three priorities this autumn, they would be: the first, make the most of stale seedbed where possible and use a robust rate of glyphosate. Second, it would be delayed drilling where possible to reduce grass weed pressure. And the third, don't underestimate the importance of crop choice and pre-emergence herbicides, especially the timing of pre-emergence herbicides. If brome is a major issue, avoid winter barley and winter oats, and always drill into a good condition and apply the pre-emergence herbicides within 24 to 48 hours after drilling.
Okay, very solid information there. Vijay, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Michael.
And people can listen to more research coming from Vijay's team when he delivers a paper on pre-emergence herbicides at this year's Crops Forum, which will be held in the Killishy Hotel, Naas, on Thursday, September the 10th. If you're enjoying the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.